Somewhere tonight, someone is turning down more money than most people make in a year for a car. Not a supercar. Not something with a badge that screams wealth. Just a Japanese coupe that most people ignored 20 years ago, the kind of car dealerships used to discount just to clear the lot. Today, the same car sits behind a locked garage door, and its owner will not sell it for any price you can name. This is happening more often than most people realize. Quietly, patiently, a small group of owners is holding on to machines that used to be considered disposable. Daily drivers, weekend toys, cars traded in without a second thought. Now those same cars are being pulled from classifieds, hidden from dealers, and passed down instead of sold. Something changed. The question is what, and why almost nobody saw it coming until the prices had already tripled. Today we're counting down 10 modern classics their owners refuse to let go of. The hidden reasons behind the refusal, the moments the market shifted without warning, and the mistakes still being made by people who don't understand what they're looking at. By the end, you'll understand why the smartest move in this market might already be sitting in someone's driveway. Most people's first mistake with this list is assuming it starts with something rare. It doesn't. It starts with 4 cars that anyone could have bought for cheap money in the early 2000s, and almost nobody did, because almost nobody believed they'd matter. Take the Mitsubishi Evo VI. For years it sat in classifieds as just a rally car for people who liked oversteer and didn't mind fixing things. Dealers moved them fast and cheap because nobody was holding out for top dollar. Then, one by one, owners realized something dealers never told them. Mitsubishi had already stopped building anything like it. No replacement was coming. The last true evolution of a legend was quietly disappearing from driveways, and by the time people noticed, half of them were gone, crashed, rusted, or converted into track cars that would never be original again. The Subaru 22B SDI made the same mistake look worse. Only a few hundred were ever built for international markets, and in period, most were driven exactly the way Subaru intended, hard, often, and without mercy. Historical production records confirm just how small that number actually was. That's the twist collectors didn't expect. The very thing that made the 22B special was also erasing it, one hard launch at a time. Then there's the Nissan Silvia S15, a car so tied to drift culture that people assumed it would always be common. It wasn't. Import restrictions in major markets quietly locked entire generations of buyers out, while the cars that did slip through kept getting modified beyond recognition. Unmolested examples became the real rarity, not the car itself. And the Toyota Celica GT-Four almost didn't survive its own reputation. A rally-bred all-wheel drive coupe that most owners drove like a normal Toyota, never realizing what sat underneath. Most were used up and quietly scrapped. For different cars, for different mistakes. The same lesson, repeated without anyone connecting the dots, until now. But the next car on this list didn't just become rare by accident. Its owners are turning down 6-figure offers on purpose, and the reason has nothing to do with the money at all. For a long time, the Honda Integra Type R had an image problem. It was affordable, front-wheel drive, and built by a company known for reliability, not exclusivity. Serious collectors looked past it. Casual buyers modified it into something unrecognizable, chasing bigger turbos and louder exhausts on a car that was never designed to be loud. By the early 2010s, finding one that hadn't been touched felt almost impossible. That's the part most people still don't know. Honda didn't just tune the DC2's engine. They hand-selected and hand-ported the cylinder heads on the assembly line, a process normally reserved for cars costing far more. Each one was individually checked and stamped by the technician who balanced it. No mass-produced Honda before or since received that level of attention. Most owners drove theirs for years without ever learning that detail, treating it like any other daily driven coupe, which is exactly why so few clean examples survived. While rally-bred all-wheel drive cars were being locked away by nervous first owners, Integra Type RS were being driven hard, tracked hard, and eventually crashed or swapped into projects that stripped out everything that made them worth keeping. Enthusiast forums and long-running registries have spent years trying to count how many hand-ported examples remain untouched. The number keeps shrinking. Here's where it gets strange. In recent auction results, a completely stock, unmodified DC2 has consistently out-earned heavily built examples with twice the horsepower. On paper, that shouldn't happen. More power usually means more value. But collectors aren't buying horsepower anymore. They're buying the version Honda intended, built by hands that don't do that kind of work today. Owners who understand this won't even discuss selling. Not because the offers aren't tempting. They are, but because they know what happens to a stock Integra once it leaves their garage. It rarely stays stock for long. That contradiction, a cheap Honda quietly outpricing its own tuned versions, is only the beginning. The next car on this list carries the same kind of secret, except this time, the engine itself is the reason owners refuse to let go. In 2013, a man in Ohio sold his Honda S2000 for $11,000. He needed the cash, the car needed a clutch, and at the time, that felt like a fair trade. He didn't think about it again until 2019, when he tried to buy a similar one back. The price had more than doubled. Today, clean examples routinely sell for what would have bought two brand-new economy cars back when he let his go. He's told the story publicly more than once, always ending the same way. He's still looking, and he still hasn't found one he can afford. He's not alone. Owner forums are full of similar stories. People who assumed a 10-year-old Honda with cloth seats and no turbo could never be worth chasing. What they missed was sitting under the hood the entire time. The S2000's F20C engine was tuned to redline at 9,000 RPM, a figure that had no equal in a mass production car at the time. Honda's own engineering documentation confirms it was the highest specific output naturally aspirated engine ever installed in a production road car when it launched. No turbo, no shortcuts, just precision machining and a rev limiter that felt more like a challenge than a warning. That engine was also the car's biggest flaw. It made almost no usable power below 6,000 RPM, which meant casual drivers found it frustrating in daily traffic. Reviewers at the time noted the disconnect. A sports car that felt sluggish unless you worked for it. Plenty of first owners traded theirs in specifically because of that complaint, chasing something friendlier and easier to live with. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. The exact characteristic that pushed casual owners away is now the reason collectors specifically seek this generation out. A forgiving engine would have made the S2000 easy. The unforgiving one made it rare, demanding, and eventually legendary, because most people couldn't be bothered to master it, and the ones who did never wanted to sell. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone still holding on to theirs. How do you put a price on an engine most manufacturers were never brave enough to build again? The next car on this list didn't earn its reputation through precision. It earned it through defiance, by refusing to die even when its own reliability record was working against it. For almost a decade, the Mazda RX-7 was considered a warning, not an investment. Rebuilt engine. Watch for apex seal wear. Budget for a rebuild before you even buy one. That reputation followed the FD3S generation everywhere it went, and it nearly killed the car's resale value entirely. By the mid-2000s, running examples were being sold for parts car money, because buyers assumed a rotary engine was a ticking clock, not a feature worth paying for. Here's what most people missed while they were avoiding it. The twin-turbo 13B REW wasn't unreliable because Mazda built it poorly. It was unreliable because almost nobody who owned one understood how to maintain a rotary engine correctly. Owner registries and rotary specialist shops have said the same thing for years. Properly warmed up, properly oiled, and never left to idle too long, these engines could run well past 100,000 miles. The problem was never the engineering. It was 3 decades of owners who treated a rotary like a piston engine and paid for that mistake with a blown apex seal. That reputation scared away exactly the kind of casual buyers who tend to wreck a car's rarity. The ones who treat a sports car like a toy for 2 years, then flip it. Instead, the RX-7 ended up almost entirely in the hands of specialists. People who understood the engine, respected it, and weren't going anywhere. Which means, unlike almost every other car on this list, the FD3S was never diluted by a wave of careless ownership. It was filtered by its own reputation before collectors ever got involved. Now that same scarcity is working in reverse. Specialist-maintained examples with full documentation are commanding prices that would have sounded absurd 15 years ago, and the gap between a well-kept FD3S and a neglected one has never been wider. The engine that once scared buyers away is now the reason serious collectors pay extra for proof of correct maintenance. It's a strange kind of survival story, A car that got rarer not because people wanted to keep it, but because most people were too intimidated to ruin it. The next car on this list didn't need a cult following to earn its place in history. It had a legend attached to a name, and that name belonged to one of the greatest drivers who ever lived. Most performance cars from the early 90s tried to impress you with numbers. Honda tried something different with the NSX. They handed a prototype to a Formula One driver and asked him to break it. That driver was Ayrshire Senna, and the story has been told so often it's easy to forget how unusual it actually was. Honda's own development records confirm that Senna spent time testing prototypes at Suzuka, then came back with blunt feedback. The chassis felt too soft, too easy to unsettle at speed. Engineers didn't dismiss him. They rebuilt the platform's rigidity around his notes, tightening the structure until it matched what a Formula One driver considered acceptable. That single decision is baked into every NSX that left the factory afterward, whether the owner ever knew it or not. Most didn't. For years, the NSX was marketed and sold as Honda's usable supercar, reliable enough to drive daily, comfortable enough for a commute, quiet enough that neighbors wouldn't complain. Which is exactly the problem. A car built to be lived in gets lived in hard. Service records show early examples racking up enormous mileage totals, treated less like an exotic and more like an expensive commuter, because that's precisely how Honda designed it to feel. That usability, the very thing that made it approachable, is what kept prices low for decades while other exotics from the same era climbed out of reach. Buyers wanted drama. The NSX gave them competence instead, and competence doesn't headline magazine covers. It headlines something else now. As collectors started re-examining the era, the chassis story resurfaced, and buyers realized they weren't just chasing a well-built Honda. They were chasing a car quietly engineered by one of the greatest drivers in motorsport history, sold at a price that undersold what it actually was. Here's a question worth sitting with. Would you daily drive a car like this, treating it exactly the way Honda intended, or would you lock it away the moment you understood what was inside it? Owners are split, and the disagreement says a lot about what collecting has become. Because the next two cars on this list didn't earn their place through quiet engineering brilliance. They earned it through headlines, restrictions, and auction rooms that turned into battlegrounds. For years, the Nissan Skyline GT-R existed in the United States the way a rumor does, talked about constantly, owned by almost nobody. Strict import laws kept the R34 generation locked out entirely, and federal agents seized more than a few examples that slipped through on technicalities, crushing some of them outright. A car legally banned from the road, it was most famous for racing on television and video games. That contradiction alone should have killed demand. Instead, it did the opposite. Scarcity created by law hits differently than scarcity created by low production numbers. Buyers couldn't simply order one from a dealer or import one legally for decades after its release. Import compliance records show the earliest legal pathways for our R34S didn't fully open in major markets until the car had already turned 25 years old. That's 2.5 decades of demand building against a wall that never moved, while the cars themselves aged, got wrecked, or stayed locked away in Japan, completely out of reach for most of the audience desperate to own one. When that wall finally started coming down, the auction results made headlines nobody expected. Documented sales have shown our R34 GT-RS, particularly rare and V-Spec 2 variants, crossing the $500,000 mark at major auction houses, a figure that would have sounded like a typo to anyone shopping for one in the early 2000s. Bidding wars between collectors on opposite sides of the world became normal, each one pushing the next result higher. Somewhere in that climb, a familiar regret story kept repeating. Original Japanese owners who sold their R34S in the early 2000s, back when export demand barely existed, watched from a distance as the same cars resurfaced years later worth 10 times what they'd accepted. A few have spoken publicly about it, always with the same tired disbelief. They didn't sell a car. They sold a lottery ticket before the numbers were drawn. Owners who kept theirs understand exactly what they're holding now. Not just a car banned from an entire country for most of its life, but proof that restriction doesn't kill desire. It concentrates it, lets it build in silence, then releases all at once. But even this car, with its headlines and $500,000 hammer prices, isn't the reason this entire category of collecting exists in the first place. That distinction belongs to one car left. the one that made everyone start paying attention to begin with. Before any of the cars on this list mattered to collectors, one car mattered to Hollywood. In 1999, a movie about street racing put an orange Toyota Supra on screen, and something shifted that nobody in the auto industry fully predicted. A car that had already been quietly discontinued in most markets suddenly became the most requested platform for an entire generation of builders. That timing wasn't luck. It was the beginning of everything this video has been building toward. Here's the detail most casual fans miss. Toyota's own engineering documentation shows the 2JZ GTE engine under the hood was overbuilt from the factory, using a cast iron block designed to handle far more boost and horsepower than Toyota ever advertised. Tuners discovered this almost by accident, pushing stock internals to power figures that should have destroyed a normal engine, and watching them survive anyway. That single design decision turned an already desirable sports car into the foundation of an entire tuning subculture, one that's still active today, which created a problem nobody saw coming. Demand for built, modified Supras skyrocketed so fast that stock, unmodified examples became the actual rarity. Owners who wanted to build their dream setup didn't care about originality. They wanted a blank canvas. For years, a stock 2JZ Supra was worth less to buyers than a heavily modified one, because the market rewarded potential over preservation. That flipped harder than almost any car on this list. As the generation aged, collectors realized factory original examples, with matching numbers and untouched interiors, had become far scarcer than the built cars everyone assumed were more valuable. Recent auction results confirmed the reversal. Pristine stock Supras now regularly outsell modified examples with significantly more horsepower, the exact same pattern that played out with the Integra Type R earlier in this list, except at a much higher price point. The regret stories from this car cut the deepest. Owners who sold clean, original Supras before 2015, back when six-figure sales were unthinkable for a Toyota, have watched the same generation become one of the most expensive Japanese cars in collector history. Some have spoken about it online, always circling back to the same realization: they didn't just sell a car. They sold the car that started this entire shift in how the world thinks about Japanese performance vehicles. Owners who still have theirs won't discuss numbers. Not because they don't know what it's worth, but because a number was never really the point. What they're holding on to is the car that proved a mass-produced coupe could become a cultural artifact, a financial asset, and a piece of history all at once. And once you understand that, letting it go stops feeling like a sale. It starts feeling like erasing the story entirely. 10 cars. 10 different reasons owners refuse to sell. But underneath all of them sits the same quiet truth this entire video has been circling. None of these cars became valuable because someone decided to make them rare. They became valuable because, for years, almost nobody treated them like they mattered. They were driven hard, modified without thought, traded in for something newer, or sold off during a moment when cash felt more useful than a garage toy. The scarcity wasn't manufactured. It was earned, one careless decision at a time, by people who never stopped to ask what they were actually holding. That's the part worth sitting with tonight. Somewhere in a driveway, a garage, or a used car lot, the next car on this list is still being ignored, still being treated as ordinary, still one bad decision away from becoming somebody else's regret story. The owners who understand this now don't need six-figure offers to know what they have. They already know. That's why the offers keep coming, and why the answer keeps being no. So here's the question worth leaving in the comments. Which of these 10 would you refuse to sell, no matter the offer? And what's the one car you already gave up that you still think about? Because next time, we're covering the ones that almost made this list, and why some of them might be the smartest by nobody's making yet.